Okay, thanks, Natalie. So how can experimentation drive transformative innovation in real places? That's what we're here to talk about for the next session, and we're very lucky to have Alex Glennie with us. Alex is a senior policy manager at Nesta's Innovation Growth Lab, and she leads engagement work with an international network of innovation policymakers, helping them to embed experimentation practices in how they work and also facilitating learning opportunities between them. So previously at Nesta, Alex has conducted comparative research on inclusive innovation policies and worked with government innovation agencies around the world on strategy and policy. So she's joined by a brilliant panel today. She'll be discussing together with them the importance of creating transformative innovation strategies and policies that are evidence-based, rooted in communities, and that acknowledge in particular where a country, region or local area is situated in terms of the entire process of innovation. So together they'll be calling for a culture of exploration and experimentation to develop and continually adapt innovation policies that are fit for purpose and also for context. So over to you, Alex, and I hope you all enjoy the session.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and welcome everybody to today's session. We're really delighted to have you here with us for this exploration of how transformative innovation can be encouraged through the application of experimental, context-driven approaches to policy. So please do introduce yourselves in the chat. My colleague Nyangla Zolo will be interacting with you there. It's a real shame that we can't see all of you, but we do want to have your comments and questions as we're going along so that we can respond to them, we can talk to you, and to make this as interactive as possible within the confines of an online space. So yes, I work at the Innovation Growth Lab at Nesta as a senior policy manager, and I'll say just a little bit more about what we do there in a minute. But before that, I wanted to introduce my collaborators in this session today. So I'm very pleased to be joined by Dan Bresnitz and by Geeta Nathan. So I'll start by doing some introductions. So starting with Dan, Dan's a university professor and Monk Chair of Innovation Studies at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. He also has a cross appointment there in the Department of Political Science, where he's co-director of the Innovation Policy Lab, senior fellow of Massey College, and many other affiliations in addition to that, which he can say maybe a little bit more about. And Professor Bresnitz is known worldwide as an expert on rapid innovation-based industries and their globalization, as well as for his research on the distributional impact of innovation policies, so thinking about the impact that innovation policies are having in terms of inequality. His most recent book, Innovation in Real Places, Strategies for Prosperity in an Unforgiving World, offers pragmatic advice for policymakers while also debunking some of the widespread myths about innovation, growth and prosperity. It was chosen by the Financial Times as one of the best business books of 2021, and I can highly recommend it myself. Very interesting. Please do go and read it. So we're delighted to have Dan here with us today. And then Geeta is Head of Economics and Insights at Innovate UK, which is the UK's innovation agency. She leads a team that focuses on impact, evaluation, thought leadership research, and strategic data analysis. And their objective in that team is to try and understand how Innovate UK programs are delivering economic and sustainable impact, both at the business level, but also at the macro level. And Geeta has a very long career in economics, having worked previously both in the construction sector, in the banking sector, and she's taught economics previously in the past. So delighted to have you here with us today as well, Geeta. And I think between us, we cover the worlds of policy, practice, and research, which is quite an interesting intersection at which to be having this conversation. So as for me, I work at the Innovation Growth Lab, which is a global initiative that brings together governments, researchers, policymakers, and foundations in partnership. We're hosted by Nesta, which is the UK's Innovation Foundation for Social Good. And what we're really trying to do at IGL is to try and increase the impact of innovation and growth policy by making sure that new ideas and robust evidence are informing it. We're trying to help organizations become more experimental, to test ideas in rigorous ways, and to learn from each other about how to do this, which is why we're set up as a partnership and a network. And we work with lots of different organizations that encourage innovation, entrepreneurship, and growth. We're working with innovation agencies across Europe and Latin America, with the US Space Agency, NASA. We're working with the UK government, the European Commission on some of their big experimentation funds. So really trying to help build more experimental policy ecosystems in the innovation space and think about what that looks like from a variety of angles. But what do I mean by experimentation? Because I think this is a word that gets used a lot. I know it's been talked about across some of the other sessions at this conference so far, and it's something that we're all encouraged to be. But what do we mean by that? So most people, or a lot of people, use the word experimentation to describe just the process of trying something new. For us, we go a step further. For us, experimentation is a structured learning experiment. So a test done in order to learn if something works or if it's true. So experiments have a structure, they have a learning question, something you're trying to find out, a clear question to be answered or a hypothesis to test. And they have a clear process for gathering data that will help you prove or disprove that hypothesis. We're trying to identify impact through experiments to see whether the change that you've made has actually had an impact, whether it's been effective or not. So we try and set them up with policymakers in a way that you'll actually be able to determine cause and effect, including through using methods like randomized control trials. And then crucially, we want to help people generate evidence that will help them make a decision. So experiments for us are something that will help you to know whether you should be rolling out a new policy or continuing or stopping a program that isn't working. So we really want experiments to be generating evidence that will help innovation policymakers be able to do that. And we think that experimentation is really important in the field of innovation policy because there are such complex social challenges that it's trying to address. Lots of unpredictabilities, new opportunities and challenges coming up all the time. So it's really hard to know how to address some of these problems. You might consider lots of options, but then usually policymakers only take one of them forward. And they're often faced with pressures to act, to be seen to be delivering a program. So rather than trying lots of different things and seeing what works, they tend to go with one potential solution. So we would argue that it would be better to flip that. So starting small, trying lots of things in a systematic way that will help you to know which ones are working, which ones should be stopped, which ones should be scaled up. So sort of really starting from that perspective. So we thought that this approach felt really relevant to the theme of the Transformative Innovation Policy Conference this year. I know there's been some discussion of experimentation across some of the other sessions already this week. And together, Geeta, Dan and I want to think about sort of what are some of the assumptions that are driving innovation policy making currently. How is innovation policy being made? What are some of the really important things we need to be thinking about when it comes to designing for a very uncertain world where things keep changing? So I want to give both of our speakers a chance to present first, to give us a bit of context on their background, what they do, their ideas, and then we'll move into a panel discussion where we can have a more sort of structured conversation, but with space for all of us to ask questions. And then, of course, we really want to give an opportunity to people who are watching along with us to ask questions with their input, their ideas as well. So we'll be leaving time at the end definitely to take questions and to hear more from other people who are attending. So before that, Dan, let me turn to you first for an opening provocation. What are some of the things that innovation policymakers have been getting wrong? How should we be thinking about supporting transformative innovation in these uncertain times that we live in?
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing me in. Indeed, it's too bad it's online and not in a physical space, since I think we're all humans. We like to actually be a social animal. Can I have my slide, please? Okay, so I hope you see the slides. And what I was asked to do is to very briefly use this book to provocate, annoy, create some debate about some of the things we have been talking about. And I want just to say one more thing, apart from what Alex has said. I also work with CIFR, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and we have started a global network of engineers, social scientists, historians, law scholars thinking about those issues of innovation, equity, and the future of prosperity, and how indeed you can do research and develop policies that will do both. So we can put that on the side, but anyone who's interested in that, I would love to hear more about. Next slide, please. So I think that the first thing that we have to do is to actually remind all ourselves is what is innovation and why should we care about it? Because we bandied this word around for the last 20 years as if there is no tomorrow. And I will argue that innovation, and that's really important when you read too many policies around the world, is not invention, and it is not only coming up with a new latest high-tech gadget. What innovation is, unlike invention, so if invention is I and my students will go to a lab and come up with a new idea for a new app, we might even do a new prototype, that's still not innovation. Innovation is a proposal, action or actions of bringing those ideas into the economy, into the market, in the case of what we are talking about today. So it's from taking those new ideas and coming with new products, or to improve them, devising them, coming up with new services. It's in all stages, from this novel idea to the after service. And it's impactful, and that's what I think too many of us who do innovation policies, and I've seen in that in both ways, both as a scholar, as a policymaker. It is impactful because it's continuous, not because it is breakthrough. And we actually have a case in point, and that's COVID. I mean, it's lovely that we came up with a new molecular that actually seems to work for at least the first COVID. And then, but in order to even that start to work, we had to devise ideas of how to manufacture it, how to distribute it, new material science to get the glass right, because it was, you had to distribute it when it's so cold. And as we now know, we have to, if we actually want to have a world in COVID in which it's really endemic and not completely destructive and disruptive, we need to continuously invent in the way that we have new version of those vaccines, and even more importantly, every 6 months, more or less, produce several billions of those vaccines and move it so every human on Earth have a chance of getting it. And therefore, it's also critical when we think about policies to remember who are the only two agents of innovation in the economy, and those are individuals, what we call entrepreneurs, or companies. All the rest, including my beautiful universities, can be helpful, but might also be a destruction if we don't remember who are the two agents that their change in behavior will actually change innovation in the economy. Next slide, please. I think we are frozen. So I will just continue to talk, and you should basically just forget this slides that you see. Oh, excellent. So as I just mentioned, innovation-based growth is the only way to achieve long-term sustained prosperity. And because of that, worldwide, trillions of dollars have been wasted mostly blindly on copying in the last few years the Silicon Valley model of backup startups. Further, and we now know that the recent version of the Silicon Valley model actually leads to growing inequality, and I will show you one of those cases. So a question that we have as we devise innovation policies is, can you create actually local growth? And when I talk about local growth, I'm talking about levels below the state, below the country, without a flourishing high-tech industry. And can innovation-based growth create local prosperity as well as magnificent wealth for the few? And next slide, please. And I would argue that yes, it can. And if we want to understand the options, right, and move to those experiments that Alex talked about, we have to understand how the global system of production has, and of goods and services, has changed. Now we are very much aware of that because of a disruption of global supply networks and chain, or whatever you want to call them. But what has happened in the last 20 or 30 years is that activities, not necessarily whole industries, are now spatially clustered. I'll give an example from the semiconductor industry, which again, everybody is now very well aware of because of a company called TSMC is the only one that still know how to innovate in the production of semiconductors. If you look at the semiconductor industry and you look at places that we know are miracles of innovation, Silicon Valley, Tel Aviv, Israel, Seoul, Korea, Hsinchu, Taiwan, and Shenzhen, China, you will see that all of those places have really successful semiconductor industry. And as a matter of fact, you will see many of the same companies operate in all of those places. But what has completely changed then from the past is if we then look at what actually happened in those cases, you will see that each one of those places is focused around a specific stage. So in Israel and Silicon Valley is the first stage of putting ideas into silicon. As we now know, in Taiwan, it's a place where they know how to take those ideas and actually put them on silicon. In Korea, they are focusing on specific niches that are critical niches and controlling them. So indeed, in every smartphone that you buy, even in Apple, the second highest profit go to a Korean company, usually Samsung. And in Shenzhen, it's the place where you know you can innovate and play and create actually products consistent of tens of thousands of components with constantly changing materials and be able to produce them going up and down and sell them around the world. So very, very different really industries within those global industry. They're not the same. And those are real choices because each one of those models have very significant distributional differences. And more importantly, you develop specific sets of innovation capabilities and the specific institutional system around it which allow it to excel long time, which do not necessarily work in other stages. So you choose something that will stay for the long term, real choice, but they're also a real choice because they decide who you employ, how much are you going to pay them, how you incentivize innovation, who is winning, who is losing in your locale. Next slide, please. So let me make it slightly less abstract. And I'll go very, very quickly because I think we are running out of time in example of each of those four cases. So the first case is the novelty is Israel. And I think it's a beautiful case of the good, the bad, and just the plainly sad. And again, we have a beautiful picture. Good. So first of all, let's talk about the miracle. In '68, most people are not aware of that. Israel was one of the least innovative countries in the world. And indeed, as an example, they have 886 R&D workers with any kind of academic education in the whole civilian sector. So basically, less people than in one of my biggest lecture halls when I do an introductory course for undergrads. This is not a spelling mistake. This is the rate of inflation within 10 years. You can see it by the name of a currency. It started as the Israeli pound, then moved to the shekel, and then to the new Israeli shekel because they ran out of ideas how to call their own currencies. And yet, by 2000, IT export not only were very big for the size of the economy, but 71% of industrial export and 70% of GDP growth was just in the startup sector. So not only they moved from being not innovative, just the startup sector became the engine of the whole economy. And there's, everything that you want to measure innovation with, very, very successful. The problem is the left behinder. In '68, economic equality was the second most egalitarian Western democracy in the greater OECD. 2021, it's the second most unequal among rich OECD economies. And when you want to understand how bad it is. 1 of every 5 households, 1 of every 5 families in Israel is now under the poverty line. And yet, it's somehow every city thinks that Israel is a wonderful success that they want to imitate for their own people and want to look like Silicon Valley, which is slightly puzzling to me. Next slide, please. Stage 2, design, prototype, development, and production engineering. And on purpose, I move as far away from the newest ICT to one of the oldest industry in the world, which is shoes manufacturing. And if you talk about shoe manufacturing, and especially the highest of the highest luxury women's shoes, so shoes that start in several hundred euros and move to the several thousands, the shoes that used to be the heroes of the Sex and the City, playing slightly less important role in the sequel now. Each and every one of those shoes at some point visited this very tiny region in Italy. And the reason is that what Brenta is doing is enabling those ideas, unlike what you see maybe in reality shows where, you know, there's this designer and she or he within a day design a shoe and then the shoe appear and people can walk with it. It's actually very difficult to come from a design to a shoe that humans can actually wear. Not only wear, but if they pay thousands of dollars, they expect to wear it maybe several times. It's a human body in the shoe. So there's pressure, there's sweat, there's chemical reaction. The shoe still needs to actually operate. And you need to be able to do that and produce few thousands of those shoes for about 600 different new shoes every year very quickly in a certain price range. And what the Brenta people know what to do is to take those design and work with the designer in order to produce this final shoe. In order to do that, you needed, and the other very interesting thing about Brenta, which we can talk about later, this transformation, this is a new transformation. Until the 80s, Brenta was just mass producing shoes for other countries' brands. And it was business-led, unlike all other cases that we usually talk about. So the business-led and the local government followed. And what is very, you can immediately see that you need to have different innovation capability, different roles for policymakers, different education system, different financial system with having a startup community, different ways in which you actually connect to the global economy. And in this case, widespread prosperity, good jobs for a wide array of different skill sets. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll do it very, very quickly. Taiwan, what is interesting about Taiwan is, again, they focus on a very different stage. Everybody heard about Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation and Silicon, but what you might not know that if you like bikes, the Taiwanese have done the same with bikes in a different technology of material science and carbon fiber frames for the bikes, which you have a picture here. And if you're just interested, I would highly recommend looking at the story of giant bicycles. And that also happened because of a very specific set and model of operation of innovation policy, public, private, research and development, and then the diffusion of the results into the industry. So again, very different innovational capacity, different rules for policymakers, education, financial system, local global flows. You can even think about what are the financial needs for a company in order to build companies like TSMC and giant bicycles versus what are the financial needs if what your aim is to create startups and sell them for a lot of money, who is being employed and how and where. Next slide, please. Okay, we are stuck, so I'll just give you the brief, and the brief is, of course, was I was going to show you example from Shenzhen and how Shenzhen completely, for example, transformed the the smartphone industry. So we are not talking just about and of course the drones, and of course everything else. So, and all the companies that can really compete with Western companies head to head are all from Shenzhen, not from Beijing, not from Shanghai. And they all started from producing stuff, really figuring out how to produce and then innovating around the production. Huawei, ZTE, DJI, Vivo, all those companies. Again, I'm repeating myself and I'm running out of time, and we have a problem with a PowerPoint, but different in everything that is important, much wider prosperity, different. So you have seen that there is at least 4 different models. Next slide, please. And here is one thing that I want to emphasize in the last 2 or 3 minutes that I have. It's really nice to claim that you experiment. It's really nice to claim that you have an innovation policy. But I actually think that the most important thing that we need to have is a vision. And I'm not talking about the grand vision. We are going to be the most innovative country in the world. I'm talking about a very pragmatic vision that every place should have. If you're successful, how would you look like in 10 or 15 years? What kind of companies do you have? What kind of things they're supposed to do? What kind of people they're supposed to employ, and what skills they need? And then you can reverse engineer and start to develop through experimentation, innovation policy that leads you to that goal. What we have too many times is just this flimsy idea of innovation means more patent or more something or looking like Silicon Valley. And then you can't really experiment when you don't even know what your target is. So I want to emphasize the importance of vision, and too many times when I'm talking to locals, we don't have it. Next slide, please. I will conclude by basically saying that as you look at the vision, as you experiment, as you understand and figure out and focus on the changing behavior of only 2 agents of innovation in the economy, so your policy actually needs to change the capabilities and the behavior of firms and individuals. You need to also think, and you have a vision, and you decided which stage, and you decided what kind of equality you want in your locale. You have to focus, constantly look at those 4 fundamentals. The flows of local, global knowledge, demand, and inputs, because we are working in a global system. The supply and creation of public and semi-public goods, which I will happily talk more about later. The local ecosystem that actually reinforces firm-level benefits for the business models of the stage of production and innovation we looked at. And the co-evolution, what we also talk about experimentation, but it's not just enough to experiment, of the 3 previous fundamentals and the role of public policy. And why it's not enough just to experiment, you constantly need to change your policy with the changing domestic and global condition. So like for the last sentence, like look back at Israel. Innovation policies that move an economy from having almost no innovation are not effective when you're the world-leading innovator hub for extremely high-tech ICT. And if you're not changing your policy in tandem with that changes, you're going to become extremely ineffective. And that has also happened in multiple locales around the world. So there's a need to co-evolve together with a need to experiment. Thank you so much. I hope you've seen at least part of a presentation, and please feel free to contact me and talk with me later if you so wishes. Just send me an email.
Thank you so much, Dan. I could see the slides eventually. There was a little bit of a lag, but apologies for that. And thank you for sharing all those interesting examples. I think there's so much we could talk about in all of them, and sort of applying that idea to thinking about these transformative innovation policies. So looking forward to coming back to those points in the panel discussion. But before that, I wanted to also give Geeta a chance to present and share. So Geeta, let me turn to you. And as someone who's working in the heart of the government innovation system, you've got sort of the inside perspective on how some of these questions are playing out actually on the inside. Innovate UK has recently developed a new strategy and business plan. It puts sort of missions at the heart. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit more with us about the transformation that you're undergoing as an organisation.
Can I have the first slide? Brilliant. So as Alex has just said, Innovate UK in last November in 2001 published its action plan for UK business innovation. What I'd really like to highlight first is that innovation is the lifeblood for businesses, but it's also the lifeblood for economic and social growth. Especially as we're coming out of the pandemic, we realise, and as does sort of, I think, central government, that innovation is going to be critical to drive in societal as well as economic recovery. It's fundamental. And we would have also, I'm sure you've all seen, but also as part of the recovery plan that the government has put in place, BEIS also last year published a UK innovation strategy. And on the back of that, we have now published our action plan. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background to the audience who may not be very aware of Innovate UK and what we actually focus on. So we're the UK Innovations Agency, and our footprint in innovation is frontier innovation. So we are at the sort of high technology, that sort of value add level of support in terms of funding as well as activities that we do. But we also look at the bigger picture of how innovation is affecting the wider economy. So what's important to sort of put some context to the plan for action? When the pandemic hit, we clearly went through a structural change and we carried out a survey. First wave was in the summer of 2020. And what we found was, as with most sectors, innovating businesses were really struggling. Cash flow problems, they were cutting back on research and development investment, they were struggling with supply chains, as many other sectors were doing in the UK. What we've seen is we've done several waves after that, and in wave 4 of our business survey, which was conducted last November 2021, we found, yes, innovating businesses were starting to recover, but they hadn't yet reached pre-pandemic levels. And what was sort of more concerning was that there was also still quite a large number of businesses within our portfolio which were still holding back on investment and R&D. So it really was showing to us how important it is for us as a public organisation to really support businesses, get back on track in investing in R&D. Can I have the next slide, please? So the plan for action, I just want to give you a bit more background before I get into the detail of it. There's 2 critical key points to how we developed the plan for action. The first is that what we realize, we work in an ecosystem. We're not on our own in a silo delivering policies for innovation, which support businesses. We are in a local innovation ecosystem, we're in a national, and we're also in a global. And so what we did really from day one was to really engage our partners and collaborators and the key actors within the business innovation ecosystem so that, first of all, we could all agree what were the strategic outcomes we were looking to achieve to support business innovation, that also that we would all be sort of engaging and sort of designing our interventions so that we were coming together to deliver those outcomes. This then links quite neatly to the other sort of element, which is different from our past strategies. We started the plan for business based on a logic model for business innovation. So Innovate UK is sort of has a tradition of evaluating at a program level and building logic models, but not at a strategic level in terms of at the organization, at the innovation, business innovation level. So this for us was a change in direction of how we were looking at policy. We were agreeing the outcomes and impacts we wanted to have, And as a result, because we had the framework of the logic model, what we were able to do was to then start to understand how the different activities were coming together, be it at a local or a national level, to deliver these strategic outcomes. Can I have the next slide, please? So the plan for action, we've sort of got three keywords: inspire, involve, and invest, really to just sort of bring some life to the plan for action. And inspire is really about, with our partners and collaborators within the ecosystem, thinking about what does the future look like? What does it, 20 years, 50 years from now, what does the economy look like? And it's really understanding what are those challenges and where do we want to get to. Involve, as the word, you'll understand, is about making sure we've got the right people, the right organizations, all coming together and really thinking about how they collaborate, partner together to sort of deliver these strategic outcomes. And the last one is invest. So yes, we want to be able to support business through financial products, as well as signposting to other partners within the innovation ecosystem. But also invest is making sure that there's the right assets, infrastructure available. For example, Innovate UK has catapults which provide testing facilities, etc., for businesses, and also making sure we've got the right, business support in place to really support businesses who are innovating. So these three words really do summarize what the plan for action is all about. Next slide, please. So before we started thinking about how are we going to prioritize the plan for action, our strategy, we had four key questions we wanted to answer. What is the business opportunity? What are the barriers to success? What has to happen to unlock them, and how should we help? We wanted to make sure that we were providing additionality and not crowding out private investment. So our first stage was actually to engage across the ecosystem, engaged with businesses, innovating businesses, large or medium-sized businesses. We engaged with local authorities at a regional level, really understanding what was happening in their ecosystems. We engaged with standard setters, regulators, as well as funding bodies, VCs, incubators, angel investors. We also engaged with international innovation agencies, really to learn what they were doing, understand what's worked, what's not worked. We sort of did a very wide range engagement on trying to answer these questions. And this helped us to start to prioritize what we saw was happening in the UK innovation ecosystem, as I've said, both at a national and at a local level. We were able to start identifying what's working, what's not working, where are the gaps, and where is there a role potentially for Innovate UK and its partners to start really trying to sort of join up the dots. Can I have the next slide, please? So through this engagement, through looking at the evidence of what was working, what was not working, the plan for action is built on strategic themes and strong foundations, and I will go through both of those. As you can see, strategic themes there are five. There are five which we really have based our plan for action: future economy, growth at scale, global opportunities, the innovation ecosystem, and government levers. Just given I'm limited on time, I'm not going to go through all five, but what I would like to do is focus on future economy. Next slide, please. So the future economy is based on our vision for what the economy will look like in 20 to 30 years, really trying to understand that. And we haven't looked at it as a sector-based approach. What we've done is taken themes. And the three themes that we have are net zero, health and well-being, and digitalization. We see these three themes running through our sectors so that they are going to be key drivers for the UK economy. And as a result, given those three themes, we see there are huge opportunities for innovating businesses to support delivering those goals within the future economy. So that gives you a sort of general overview to just one of our strategic themes. Can I have the next slide, please? So within this concept of our themes, we are going to be looking at innovation plan for action through a missions-based lens. The missions have yet to be sent by government, but what you can see is what we're recognizing through a missions-based approach, which is not new for Innovate UK, because we have been delivering the industrial strategic funds over the past 5 years. We recognize that you need to capture the whole ecosystem. It's not just about funding. It's not just about thinking about IP. It is about looking at all the different actors, as I've said at the beginning, that come together to deliver these strategic outcomes. With a mission-based approach, you're really setting the top level goals. So be it an economic or societal challenge. And then within those, you're really trying to understand what are those key challenges to deliver the overall outcomes for the missions. And as I said, we have 5 strategic themes, and all of them, though, are not in silo. Each one is linked. So if you think about some of the strategic themes which are on the previous slide, you've got growth at scale, you've got global, you've got ecosystem. All of them all work together and complement each other. And together, they will, for example, if we're looking at net zero, they will have their own set of ecosystem attributes, which will help to deliver and support businesses delivering the net zero outcomes that are set. So I've got here on this slide just a couple of the challenges that Innovate UK has delivered through the IFCF over the past couple of years. And some really shows that we've been quite successful in how we deliver this missions challenge-led type of programs. Next slide, please. So if you recall from the earlier slide, we talked there were strategic themes. Underneath those are what we call strong foundations. And these are our principles and our values. And what's really important about these is that these 6 strong foundations run through everything we do, be it EDI, be it place, be it societal impact. We see these as, I suppose, like streams running through all the different strategic themes, because they're relevant. Skills and talent affects everything, but it really depends on what the overall objective we're looking to have. So on that basis, it could be what's required for one of the strategic themes in terms of skills and talent is quite different for one of the others. So we really recognize that it's not just a sort of fixed model, as I sort of have said before. It is a very flexible, agile ecosystem we need, depending on the outcome that we're looking to have. So again, I don't have time. I'm really happy offline to sort of explore the strategic themes as well as the strong foundations to give you a little bit more perspective to how these are being looked at. What's really important is to go back to the logic model. Each of our strategic themes and each of our strong foundations have a set of outcomes, and they're all based on a logic model, which is embedded into the business innovation logic model. What that means is that we really start to understand how the different activities come together to deliver the overall, as I've said earlier, strategic objectives. And also with the logic model, we're able to start looking at metrics and look at performance on how we're doing. Next slide, please. So as I've said, and I've sort of just mentioned this, we've built our plan for action on a logic model. And why was this important? Because for us, we want to be able to demonstrate to our stakeholders, to businesses, really to show how we are doing and to really look at the success we're having, but also to understand what's working, what isn't working. So we also learn as an organization, and as we're delivering our activities and support, we can fine tune as we go along. So as I've said, we're going to have logic models which are underpinning our programs, which underpin our strategic themes, as well as our foundations. And each one will be embedded within the organizational logic model. We will, as normal, evaluate our programs, but we're also intending to evaluate over time our plan for action so that we can really see the difference that we have made to businesses who are innovating in the UK. And what we also hope is that as we progress, that we will be learning and be able to, as an organization and in terms of our policies, understand what's working and also when we need to sort of change our activities or stop our activities. So this gives you an overview to how we're looking now at business innovation. I'm really happy to answer any questions, and I'll hand back to Alex.
Oh, I'm back. So it'd be great to bring both Geeta and Dan back on, if our backstage wizards can do that. Great. So wanted to thank you both for those presentations. A lot of food for thought, and I think sort of having some really interesting reflections there around the different stages of innovation process, looked at from the perspective of a national innovation agency. How do you think about sort of differentiating your policies and your approaches to make the most of different capabilities across the system. But I want to start with a couple of follow-up questions on the presentations for you both, and to also give you a chance to ask each other questions. And I see that there's some interesting questions coming in the chat, so looking forward to getting into those as well. But maybe just to start with you, Geeta, following up on that presentation, hearing about Innovate UK's new themes and priorities, it sounds like there's a very wide remit there. So looking at both global transformation and competitiveness, but also enhancing local innovation, thinking about place. So I mean, how easy is it to do both of those things simultaneously?
So it's a challenge, and I think both are complementary to each other. Innovate UK, as I've said, our footprint is frontier innovation, and it is about supporting businesses who are delivering frontier innovation, be it new products and services or improving products and services and processes. But it is also about supporting those businesses to grow and potentially go global. But what we've also recognized that as part of a business growing and going global, you are actually then supporting your local economy and in terms of economic growth, as well as employment, bringing in the right skills. So we see that as a mechanism actually that is going to help the levelling up agenda within the UK. So we will also have a sort of slightly different approach, which is being driven by central government, which is very much the place in terms of within the UK is now much higher up the agenda and is actually considered sort of relevant to everything we do. So before it used to be a little bit ad hoc and there wasn't a consistent approach. Now the lens is very much that we do need to take it into consideration in terms of all our interventions and activities. And if we just go back sort of to the traditional way we look at evaluation in terms of the Green Book, what the Treasury produce, place a specific area within that in terms of what we need to demonstrate. So yes, we support our objective is to support businesses from a global level, but we're also now recognizing that that also then supports at a local level. So the two are very complementary. It's not easy, but we now are sort of starting to look at our policies on how they shape each other.
So yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of sort of interplay back and forth and understanding how those different things interact. And Dan, you were talking in your presentation about how innovation is most impactful when it's continuous, but also that we require agility and the ability to shift and change our approach as conditions change. So, I mean, how do you see innovation policy working well given these competing tensions to drive continuous innovation, but also to be able to, take a step back and be able to innovate in your processes?
First of all, there's that innovation call to unmute oneself.
Yes.
But more to the point, I think this is a really the important first thing to do is really decide not just I want to be innovative, but decide in which stage you really want to play, right? Where are you? And the way to think about it is where do you want to be on the global production network? And we can figure out, and talk at length about how you reach that decision. And by the way, it's also absolutely, by the way, okay to think about that you want to be Silicon Valley or Tel Aviv, but then be aware that there are some side effects of inequality. And you might want to think about it in advance instead of reaching the stage of Israel now, and half of what the Innovation Agency thinks about is how to deal with this growing inequality. On that, I think that the most important thing that innovation, so you need to have an organization that actually deal with it on the long time. And there's two problems with that, as you know very well. The very first thing that most politicians cannot do at all is to really experiment, because by experimentation, you mean failure. And a minister cannot fail too many times. So we need to create a buffer. So you have a buffer. So there's a political structure, arm length, whatever we want to call it, creating a buffer. So your agency, Innovate UK, whichever one, can actually do the experimentation and thinking about it without every time that it fails or even seem to be fail, immediately, the minister or the prime minister come and said, Gita, that was very lovely, but it's too risky. You already failed twice. I will not be re-elected. Goodbye. Which happens a lot. At least, so once we deal with that, what you see in a lot of those cases, all of those stages, is that the successful organizations, be there at whatever form they are, can do two things very, very well. They have an ability to think strategically, which is very important, do what you know, but they are excellent in operation. Excellent. And an organization that is not if you actually want to be able to do the experimentation, innovation, and all the rest, and do it, you have to be effective in operation. I've seen too many organizations that were, the best in class, maybe the smartest people in the room, but when they actually want to have a policy, nothing happened on the ground. So I would urge anyone who is actually listening to us, if you're really serious about experimentation, you have to have three things. Figure out how you have a buffer from the day-to-day politics so you can think long-term and fail. And then it's lovely to have a strategy, and you need to have it because you need to develop your experimentation. But if you don't develop your operation arm, and if you're not maybe the best operational unit in your government, local or national, it's lovely, but it's not going to happen.
I think the other element of this, and I think Dan touched on this through his presentation, is that what we saw in COVID was that innovation agencies had to react and be adaptable really quickly to understand what was happening to businesses, and also then come up with interventions to, to stop business. In particular, in our case, what we wanted to do was not see businesses actually collapse and then research and development stop. And so we had to be quick in how we reacted. So we put in place something called Fast Start Grant, which was a really quick turnaround grant. Normally we take several weeks for a grant application to be accepted, whereas this was in a very quick turnaround within a couple of weeks. And what we found is actually businesses who were unable, because of the pandemic, because of facilities closing, were still, though, doing research and development. They adapted to the FAST grant to do something related to COVID, and actually were able to continue with their R&D. So what we're finding now, we're learning from this, is actually there is something here to our sort of mechanisms that are in place is about being agile so that we can support businesses as things change. And I think that's also really critical, so that you don't lose the momentum behind investment in R&D that gives you that longer term impact that we're all looking for. But in the short term, businesses are still able to actively undertake research and development.
And that raises a really interesting question, because obviously the pandemic has been an extraordinary period where people have been prepared to try lots of new things and throw the usual ways of doing things out the window. How do you transition that approach to when things are more stable, when things are more business as usual, when people go back to not being in crisis mode? I don't know, Dan, have you seen any examples from your research of agencies that were able to sort of keep that continuously experimental mindset and approach?
Yes, but I have to say, as much as I love experimentation, right? Because that's also when you're allowed to think, and that's what I like to do. It cannot be the experimentation cannot be continuous for when you don't have COVID. And I'll explain. If I come up with a new program, it takes a while for the program to appear. Then it takes about 2 to 3 years for both sides, the business and the government. Again, I know I can react very quickly, right? I'm your experimental agency and very good in operation to actually perfect that. So only around year 3, you really know whether that program is working and you want to scale it up. And then, because we're talking about innovation, your aim is actually to reduce uncertainty and risk, right? So you want to be able to run it for a while. If what you have a system that the business doesn't know year after year, what are the programs, whether they can rely on those programs when they do 3 or 5 years planning, R&D takes time, whether they even have that agency to work with, and whether, you know, the uncertainty, very risk and uncertainty is reduced by working with government versus actually increased because God only knows what will happen. The politics that we talked about, you have a problem. So agencies that have been very successful in experimentation figure out the time, they constantly have programs, but they figure out the time when they need to experiment a lot, like COVID, or when they see a real gap. Then they figure out that it works, they do a scale up, and then a few years later, as they see that things change, they said, okay, the old things don't work, or there's a new gap, and they experiment again. They don't experiment so much, you know, partners in the business sector don't even know their name. I'll stop here. Sorry for
I think that's a really valid point, because before COVID, we had introduced a loans program, recognizing that there was something within our ecosystem to support business where loans actually, particularly businesses which were slightly higher up the TRL, we ran a pilot, and after 3 years, we've been evaluating, seeing what actual impact we've had. Also, our process is, going back to Dan's point, how important it is to have actually a really good process. And now that has become a permanent program. It's not that we're like scrapping that and let's move on to the next type of financial product. We really recognize that once we start to see something works, we then embed it. But again, we need to review it and evaluate it. And maybe in 10 years, there might be something, a new financial product that is more applicable. So I think it's a really valid point that you can't constantly be just planting seeds everywhere, but not actually seeing what the impact is going to be and whether it's fit for purpose still.
So I maybe wanted to sort of zoom out a little bit and think about this concept of missions. And Geeta, you mentioned that the new Innovate UK business plan and strategy is going to be focused on sort of big societal missions as well, which I think is, you know, a shift. It's a shift that we're seeing in a lot of different countries, this idea of the mission-oriented approach. And I was wondering, you know, as you were talking about developing the new logic model and thinking about how you might sort of measure your progress against these missions, what are some of the interesting questions or tensions you're thinking about there? How are you going to know that these missions are successful?
So I think there's going to be several areas. So one of the things that we're looking at, so you're going to have the economics, and sometimes the economic drivers clash with the societal drivers when you're looking at how you want to prioritize. But one of the things we're starting to do at Innovate UK, and it's not even just at a mission level, it's at a program level, is that we've introduced in a new framework, which is called the Impact Management Framework, which is actually, we are measuring and monitoring performance of businesses that we support, both from an economical, societal and environmental perspective, so that we can start to understand what impact we're having economically, as well as on a societal and environmental. We may not be targeting those areas, but we're able to start capturing what's happening on that front from the innovation and the project that we're supporting. So with that, I'm hoping that will really help us to really understand how we're, you know, how to think about impact when we get to that, the bigger picture of the mission at a much larger scale. So we're now started, we've sort of agreed economic and innovation set of metrics, which will go across all our programs. We're just about finalizing the societal and environmental. And I'm hoping that framework that's being developed will be really embedded within the missions as well, because there will be several programs within the mission that will be running. And it's really to make sure that there's a way for us to aggregate, because they will be consistent against all programs, that we can then see the impact.
Dan, for you, how helpful is this notion of missions when it comes to thinking about the different stages of innovation, and how feasible is it for all governments to be pursuing mission-oriented innovation policies?
So there's two issues here, right? One is at what level of government mission-oriented innovation policy makes sense. DARPA is a very small program for the US, accounting mistake for DoD, but has an annual budget of more than several economies. Okay, and it's located within one of what used to be the world's by far biggest economy and definitely most advanced economy. So we have different partners than the rest of the world. All those beautiful, cool robots that we see every year dancing, which now belong to Google Alphabet. You're talking about the end of a 20 years research. And putting a man on the moon in the 60s, we can count on one hand the kind of countries that can actually do that as a mission. That's one problem. And if we talk about locales, where I'm talking about, I really don't know, what the city of Birmingham would do with a mission, classic mission-oriented innovation policy, unless we redefine what does it mean to be mission-oriented policies. And we said, okay, it's not very specific, but there are grand challenges, which we know are going to be with us. For example, the energy transformation. For example, massive inequality. And then we can think about different ways to tackle them. But while I think it's an important tool to have in the arsenal, I think it fits very specific times and very specific places. So I would, the same way I would highly not recommend everybody to try to imitate Silicon Valley, I will not recommend everybody to have a mission-oriented innovation policy.
And I think that's a really fair point. I don't think that would be across the board for the whole of the UK, and that's not the perspective where we're looking. And I think the other element of how we're looking at the frontier innovation is that everybody's coming up with a new technology and a new application of it. We're also looking at the supply chains and where they're innovating within their supply chains so they can be embedded into countries abroad. It's not necessarily, I think Dan gave some really good examples. If you think about offshore renewable energy, we are not necessarily developing the frontier innovation in the UK, but what we are doing is creating the components. We're sort of becoming quite a attractive place, the northeast of England, for these components. So I think there's a mix here. It's not one size fits all across the UK, but it's very much trying to identify which areas of, from an Innovate UK perspective, which areas of frontier innovation where what we should be focused on.
And I think that, that question of places has come up a lot. And Dan, the title of your book refers to innovation in real places. And I think that's sort of at the heart of some of our conversation today. And I was wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more about how policymakers can start to think about setting that vision for local places, 10 to 15 years out. How do they start to engage in those conversations, which are very difficult to have?
So I think that the places that were capable of doing that, and here we move slightly to the side of innovation policy and into the politics of innovation policy, or the politics of growth, are places you don't need everybody, but you need you need leaders that start this conversation, and they need to have interlocutors in the other areas, and an ability to actually understand you know, the locales. And I'm the biggest company in, I'm harping on Birmingham, so I'll just use it again. Historically, me and my friend were the two biggest companies in Birmingham. Therefore, what is good for my company is good for Birmingham. And you've seen it in many places in the US, especially cases that I know, really successful locales. That the main problem with not that they didn't have leadership, but the leadership was stuck in the past without an ability to understand. So you need to have a leadership. The leadership in the places that I've seen can come from both business and government, but it needs to figure out a new vision. It needs to figure out what are the capacities, but also what capacities you want to have, and then together, exactly, we constantly say experimentation, but that's really figure out the ways to get those capacities. And, you know, since you don't really know everything in innovation, constantly, as Gita has said, figuring out where, oh, we missed that thing, we also need that. Let's start to have policies so we can do that. But it really is dependent, and I think that's the most important thing, on the people on the ground. It's really lovely that, you know, down in number 10 or Ottawa or, you know, DC will claim that they have a local place policy. If a locale says, we're not interested in playing, it wouldn't happen.
So there's a bit of an interesting challenge to the levelling up agenda here in the UK. And Gita, I was wondering, how is Innovate UK thinking about engaging people at the local level to really focus more explicitly and probably more strategically on place than the UK has in the past?
Yeah, so as I said, I think prior to Innovate UK has somewhat ad hoc approach to it. So there were certain funds which focused on place, whereas others, there wasn't any criteria for place. I think now it is going to be a consideration, as I said, for everything we do. It's one of our strong foundations. So it will, as I sort of tried to explain, it will sort of be entering into all our strategic themes. Place will have a key point. I think the other point here as well is that with that governance structure, ensuring that place is considered is going to be, but also thinking, as I think sort of Dan was starting to allude to, is thinking about the skills that are required depending on the innovation that is starting to, you know, you want to focus on at a local level. Thinking, you know, you've got a lot of diverse communities across the UK. Thinking about how do you bring those communities to think about innovation, you know, entrepreneurial businesses, etc. So there's lots of things to bring together at the same time. It's not just saying place, but then what does place, what are the components? Again, why we have put our strong foundations, we see them all interrelated. Again, from the spending review, which is now, you know, has got again a high priority for place, thinking about how does that then now get focused on in terms of a local level, what does that mean? And also from Innovate UK's perspective, we have a regional team. So we have managers across the country who are really working with local, really trying to understand through their insights gather, what are the key sectors, what are the key innovations in these areas, and what policies are relevant to them. Recognize one size doesn't fit all. So it's really, for us now, we're using that insight to draw on that. When we think about clusters, and as I said, so we'll keep repeating our footprint innovation, what does that mean within those areas that we're starting to identify these clusters? Should the local ecosystem look like, and where are the gaps, so that we can then work with our partners to support that cluster growth?
So I've been, as a moderator, sort of hogging all the question asking, but I know that there's been lots of good questions coming in on the chat as well, and would love to hear from some of the other participants that are watching us and engaging with us. So I was wondering if I could bring in my colleague Nyangla to maybe field in some of the questions from the chat so that we can try to respond to those and engage with them.
Hi everyone, it's been really great to hear everything. So some questions from the chat. We'll start off with one for Dan. So Andrew has asked, do you see experimental transformative innovation initiatives emerging in North America, particularly the regions that are less developed? Do you see the potential for these regions that have essentially been left behind for them to be able to leapfrog?
Let's start with the first, which I think is more optimistic than the second, because then we have to think about what do we mean by leapfrogging. So if you go, instead of using the extreme leapfrogging and say significantly improving and becoming both prosperous, so both rich and equal, then you see quite a lot. And as a matter of fact, you see not all of them are very innovative in their policies. Not all of them are happy places, because a lot of them are actually in the south. So there are places that there's a lot to be asked for in terms of tolerance. But if you look at their innovation economic policies, they're leader. I would look at the, for example, transformation of South Carolina in the last 20, 25 years. There's a lot to be asked for in terms of tolerance and inclusiveness of all kinds of people. But in terms of figuring out how to make the place richer, more innovative, and more equal in terms of economically speaking, it's one of the most interesting places in the US. North Carolina as well. If you look at North Carolina and you look at, for example, the biotech industry, and you see that not only it's successful, it's the one that really focused on production of biotech. I think, and if you want to venture more into the unheard of places, just look at the places where, because of Operation Warp Speed, are now leading the globe in some of the new production and material science, including with the veils that I talked about. And you actually find out that the company that developed everything and now employ all those people, and you can think about creating a cluster of areas around them, is actually in Alabama. Not in a very nice place in Alabama in terms of, it's rather rural. So I see that. What I don't see in the US is a real thinking about how they fit into a global system. I don't see a real, we sort of stumble. A much better way of thinking about it, many of those places stumble upon something that works instead of experimenting with something that works. And many of them have not developed and haven't kept the strategic capacity that we talked about of constantly moving toward that vision, and the operational capacity to do that. It's more a hit or miss, coming and going with the political winds. And if I would, so I'm hopeful, but if there's something that is missing, is a concrete effort to institutionalize those stumbling and those attempts, systemize them, and and scale them up.
That's great. I think it leads well onto this next question, which was from Teresa. And she asks, transformative innovation is about tackling societal challenges. Can you give us an example of a societal challenge that has been tackled by experimentation, or something that shows that, experimentation helps countries move towards the right direction and the right outcomes? Geeta, maybe you can jump in on this one first.
Okay, I think if you look at some of the Asian agencies, so thinking about Sweden, Norway, the Nordic countries, they have really started more societal challenges that they face, for even small things, if you think about, and they're not small things, but about the diverse set of, I suppose, diverse set of businesses applying for funding, applying to be engaged in programs. And they have looked at experimentation, and they've tried, whether it's looking at how the wording is set, how to think about the application process. And these are that we're learning now from these innovating agencies, really to think about what do we need to be doing to get a sort of wider diverse of applicants to engage with Innovate UK, and then to engage in our programs, to apply for funding. So I think there are now more and more examples across the globe starting to see innovation agencies have tried, and they have proved to be successful, and they've learned it doesn't work. So I think also one of the key things here is that, yes, experimentation, but if there's really good lessons to be learned by other countries, for us to also, clearly we've got to think about the cultural elements that you may not be able to transfer exactly, but definitely lots of learning to be done. But that does exist. I think Dan's book actually gives a lot of examples of that as well, in terms of thinking about the different innovations. So yeah, I think there are, and it's things that we're now starting to reflect on.
And Alex, this one I think was one for you. Basically, someone earlier on, I think it was Andrew, I didn't catch the name, asked that, you know, you spoke about RCTs, but the TIPC consortium tends to think that at a policy level, experiments aren't necessarily appropriate because they assume that there's a solution that already exists. So I don't know if you had a response to that.
That's a really interesting question and sort of debate to be had. I think within the Innovation Growth Lab, we've been thinking about experimentation in quite a broad way. So not just the use of randomized control trials as a method. And, you know, I think in some cases they are appropriate and often, you know, give a really good sense of impact, cause and effect, and whether a particular intervention has worked in the way that you intended it to or not, sort of the impact it has on different groups. But RCTs are not appropriate in every circumstance. So, you know, experimental governments would be thinking about putting together a toolbox of interventions, ways of testing new policies, which might include some RCTs, but would go wider than that and think about what's appropriate for the kind of challenge that they're trying to address. And I think the question also mentioned this idea of experimental spaces, which I think is a really good concept. Just the idea that it's not just about the methods that you use, but also about the culture and the mindset that exists within government. So whether there is that appetite for trying things that are different and doing that in a structured way to try and learn, whether or not it's worth investing a huge amount of budget in a new program that you're not entirely sure about or not. And I think the bigger the societal challenge, the bigger the budget that often gets put together for it. So thinking a bit more systematically about how do you know whether those interventions are going along the right track is important. So, you know, I wouldn't say that RCTs are useful in every situation, but they can be deployed strategically to really help you understand aspects of how different programs are running. But really, yeah, it'd be good to continue that conversation offline as well.
And then this next question is also for everyone. So there was a question, I think we've mentioned a lot of examples from the global north, but do you also find examples of transformative innovation? And, you know, there have been lots of cases, or some people may even believe that, you know, the global south is a lot better at innovating in environments of scarcity. So is Innovate UK looking at examples from across the world, including the global south? And Dan, have you also seen some promising examples of transformative innovation from this part of the globe?
Do you want to? Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So, go on. I don't know whose hand you're pointing right. So in terms of learning, no, we're not just restricted to specific areas. We're very much, we have a global team which engages with different countries across the world, you know, be it from the Far East through to North America, Africa. We do a lot of engagement, and also with KTN through them, we have programs which run in. We are learning constantly from different parts of the globe. So no, we're not certain geographic constraints. So no, for us, that is very much where we can learn. Clearly, certain countries or programs that are being run may not be relevant to UK is, and in terms of where the UK economy is in terms of its innovation cycle, but in terms of maybe methodologies and what we can learn from experimentation, absolutely, always open for new evidence to consider.
Dan, anything to add on that?
A little bit, and that is, I actually think that there's a lot of very interesting things. And the reason I'm like, is because we had COVID. But just before COVID, there have been a lot of very interesting experiments in the South, both in, you know, the usual places, where you would think that they would happen because they happened in the past, like Chile. But one of the most interesting things that my students, so not my research, but my students have taught me a lot, is about Nigeria and the very interesting way in which, in order to advance what we call cultural industries now, they have experimented and changed their whole IPR, intellectual property right regimes. So I think the only reason we don't know more about those attempts is because we usually tend to go where the money is, and it's for researchers and consultant and policymaker is not in the global South. It's much harder to do this research, and because they innovate in different ways than that we are used to, sometimes they're just under the radar until they become so successful that even us hear about them. So I would have loved to see many more of my students focus much more about that, using a much more open eyes of how to think about it. And especially now with hopefully COVID becomes endemic, because I would urge us to use much more field work. Right? You actually need to go over and figure out how those places work instead of just assuming that innovation there looks like innovation in Europe and North America.
This question is for Geeta from Matthias. So the topic of this conference is on sustainable transitions, and in your presentation you mentioned Innovate UK's strategic approach, but could the word strategic be replaced for systemic? Because if we're thinking about the challenges that are being addressed, for example, reaching net zero, it's obviously a systemic problem. So yeah, your response to that.
Yeah, no, I think a fair challenge. I think for us, it was very much trying to identify where were the areas of prioritization, and that's what were our strategic goals and objectives. So but clearly how that will be delivered will be systemic. And as I've said, I think for us is the links between all the different strategic themes, as well as the foundations, develop that if we're thinking about net zero, how businesses are going to support through innovation the delivery of the net zero targets. So an ecosystem that follows it, and that is systemic. So I think that's a fair challenge, but it's sort of given a bit of background why we had strategic themes rather than systemic. I think that's fair.
I think that I reached the end of the questions. I don't know if anyone from the audience wants to pop a last one in while we have a few more minutes.
Well, otherwise, I guess we, so maybe bring it back around to this idea of experimentation, and thinking about how to do that in a sustainable way within organisations. And I think experimental methods are one way of learning about what works in different contexts. Studies or policies can be replicated in different places to see if they have wider applicability. Different kinds of interventions can be tested using randomized control groups, etc. But we know that policymakers are nervous about running experiments with unknown outcomes. And I wanted to sort of maybe just come back to what I was talking about earlier about this experimental culture. And what do you, maybe one last question for the panelists, what do you think is needed to shift that culture inside government towards more of an experimental mindset and thinking about these big systemic challenges in a more sort of open way? What can help to really shift the culture in that direction from your experience?
So I think one of the biggest challenges with policy making is there is a problem and you need a solution. It isn't about really, there isn't often even the time to think about what's the best potential solution, what's your menu of choices. It's coming up with something. It's really having probably an evidence base. For us, as our team is Economics and Insights, it's very much saying actually use your evidence base. Understand what is telling you to help you formulate policy. I think the challenge is just time. You have a crisis and there's to be an intervention. It's that problem that there's never often the quality of time to really think about what are the potential solutions. And then the other element to this is we talk about agile. Businesses to be agile, that they have exogenous shocks and etc. And how do they, similarly for governments, it's thinking about I think there's something here about politicians and government policymakers having agile mindsets, and also as a business, as an entrepreneur, getting used to failing. Same with policy, having that mindset that it may not work, and you know what, you try the next step, you learn from it and you move on. So I think we've all, particularly in the UK, we're always talking about the fact that you should be learning from it applies across all the economy. I think every individual organization should have that mindset. Not taking unnecessary risk, but having the mindset that if you don't try something and champion, you're not going to learn, you're not going to evolve.
Which maybe suggests the need for a different kind of conversation with the public as well about the way in which government is operating. That narrative is not very often heard because government, wants to have all the answers and to provide the solutions. People look to them for that. But there's, something interesting when you have a more open conversation with citizens about how do we actually move forward in very uncertain times when we don't already know the outcomes.
Yeah.
I would say that one other thing I think we should also be more humble. Experimentation is good and important, but you cannot experiment all the time everywhere, especially in government. There's a reason why supposedly bureaucracy is slow, meticulous, and systematic. And there's as I said, the politics of that. So if we really want experiment, we need to figure out how to devise and allow the conditions for at least certain units, not necessarily the whole ministry, if you will, to be extremely, the place where you do the experiments and maybe scale them up when they work to units that you don't really want them to experiment. Or, politically, it's unfeasible to think that they will. And I don't think we have figured that one very, very well. Instead, we go into the extreme and either claims everybody should do experiment, or to the other extreme and don't allow any experiments. Where instead, I think we need to systemize it and figure out a division of labor, which the public, sector is actually quite good at, not just the private sector. The division of labor of where we will create the conditions and the buffers and the resources to experiment, where when they scale up, then they move to, so the way that the other unit experiment is not that they experiment themselves, but they change their policies based off experimenting unit. I don't think we have research to do that. We don't even conceptualize it very well. If there's anyone listening out there that want to do research about it, I highly recommend it.
Well, that's probably a great place to end as we're running up to the end of time. I think we've generated lots of interesting questions, as well as hopefully a few insights and answers. And really want to thank all the audience, the participants as well, for the questions and the comments they've shared. Definitely going to be going back and looking at those and taking away some big questions around how you apply experimental approaches when you're thinking about really big societal missions. Otherwise, really want to thank both of the speakers, Dan and Geeta. Thank you so much for joining us today, for your time, for your interventions, for your wisdom, and looking forward to continuing the conversation. And thank you so much to the conference organisers as well. Please do get in touch with us, anyone who's listening who'd like to pick up any of the points that we raised today.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being with us and for